Now we reach perhaps the one character from the time between the Testaments that we may possibly, perhaps, have heard of before, excluding the famous or infamous names that most people have heard of, including Alexander the Great, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, and such like. I'm thinking of a Jewish hero whose story was so well known that George Friedrich Handel set it to music, Judas Maccabeus. And if you use the same hymn book that I do, you may have sung one of Handel's great tunes from Judas Maccabeus, which is used for Thine be the glory. If you do not know it, try to learn. It's one of the great hymns of praise. First thing to remember is that Maccabeus or Maccabee, spell it either way, is not a proper name. It was a nickname given to Judas or Judah, the son of Mattathias or Mattathiah, but it is Judas that's stuck in the history books. Maccabee or Maccabeus probably means hammerer. Perhaps Judas hit his enemies like a hammer, in which case we might translate Maccabee as hammerhand. Judas hammerhand sounds suitably tough. You'd not want to mess with a hammerhand. Or it might be that Judas once, perhaps in a tight corner, used an actual hammer as a weapon. No one knows now, so picture it how you like. Maccabee was used as a title for at least 4 books that cover the time when Judas was making history. First and second Maccabees are collected in the Deuterocanonical books, the Old Testament Apocrypha, and so are considered to be part of the canon of Scripture by Roman Catholics and others. Third and fourth Maccabees are less widely accepted. Third Maccabees is used in the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, but not in the Catholic Church. And fourth Maccabees is sometimes included as an appendix to the Greek Bible, so not viewed very highly by anyone. As I've started, I'll try to sum up the 4 books in a few words. All 4 books of Maccabees can be described as giving a historical record, at least as historical writing was understood at the time. And all 4 books have either a theological or philosophical purpose. They attempt to show that God is in control and that the God of the Hebrews supplies a better guide to life than the gods, so-called, of the pagans. First and second Maccabees record the story of the Jewish people under the Seleucid Greek kings of the 2nd century before Christ. The genre, the type of writing, uses the pattern given by the Old Testament historical books, such as 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. They tell stories, but stories about events that happened, not stories as in fiction. And they make it clear that everything happens under the will of God. As we shall see in a moment, 1st and 2nd Maccabees tell of the Jews' heroic resistance to an attempt to enforce paganism on them, resistance led by Judas and his brothers. The books also warn of the danger of compromise. The Maccabees were uncompromising zealots, prepared to use violence to overthrow their pagan rulers. If Israel is truly to be the people of Yahweh, then they cannot live under a Gentile king, especially one who wants to obliterate all public aspects of Jewish faith and replace it with Hellenistic paganism. Third Maccabees goes slightly further back in time to the 3rd century before Christ. As in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Jews are facing oppression from a pagan king, but the king in 3rd Maccabees is Ptolemy IV, Philopator of Egypt, who takes his revenge on the Jews of Alexandria after the Jews of Jerusalem had refused to allow him to enter the temple. Ptolemy sends his elephants to crush the Jews, but don't worry, God intervenes and his people are saved. And 4th Maccabees describes a Jewish response to Hellenistic philosophy, answering the question that opens the book as to whether devout reason is sovereign over the emotions. Most of what I'm going to say in this presentation is based on 1st and 2nd Maccabees, with some cross-referencing to Josephus' Antiquities and Jewish War, both of which talk about the Maccabean War. These are our read sources, texts that can be read. There's also a certain amount of brown source as well, archaeological discoveries dug up from the soil of Israel, but the texts give us the clearer picture. To set the scene, we've already met Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes, Antiochus, God made manifest, second son of Antiochus III the Great, king of Seleucid Syria, now living under the shadow of Rome. In 202 BC, Rome had decisively defeated Carthage. Carthage was originally a Phoenician colony in what today we call Tunisia. The new city had become wealthy by dominating trade around the western end of the Mediterranean Sea. With Carthage crushed, Rome took its place as the dominant power in the central and western Mediterranean. When Carthage had looked like defeating Rome after Hannibal routed the Roman army at Cannae in Italy on the 2nd of August 216 BC, King Philip V of Macedon offered an alliance with Carthage. For 12 years, this looked like a jolly good plan, but once Rome had defeated Carthage, Philip was in an embarrassing position. Like Hannibal's elephants, Rome did not forget. And in 197 BC, the Romans defeated the Macedonians at Kynoskephalae in Thessaly, bringing Greece into the Roman sphere of influence. Even had they combined, the remaining Macedonian kingdoms in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, would have been no match for Rome. So the remains of Alexander's once great empire were now Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria, with Antiochus of Syria having been warned to leave Egypt alone by Roman envoy Lucius Popilius Lanus. All he could do was take out his anger on his few remaining possessions, which included Judah. And Antiochus was not impressed by the Jews' continued resistance to Hellenistic culture. The king concluded that if his kingdom was to remain viable, all his subject people had to be loyal to Antiochus and his Greek ideals. The Jews had to be compelled to conform. Antiochus still had the Hellenizing high priest Menelaus on his payroll. Between them, they had to square a circle in a way that may ring bells in our world today. How does a government that wants to promote toleration deal with a religion that is intolerant? Jews were and are strict monotheists. Hellenists might be prepared to concede that Yahweh, the God of Israel, had also revealed himself to Gentiles in the form of Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods. But this was totally unacceptable to the ultra-Orthodox Hasidim, and also to many of the ordinary people of the land. Antiochus came to realize that the only way he could achieve his goal of a Hellenistic Judah was to crush the Jewish religion. Sacred scrolls were confiscated and burnt. Worship within the temple was suspended. Sabbath was no longer to be kept holy. Kosher food laws were banned, as was circumcision. So every public demonstration of faith was now illegal. All this happened towards the end of the year 167 BC, with the final nail in the coffin being a new and smaller altar being built on top of the altar of burnt offering in the temple court. and in December 167 this new altar was formally dedicated to the worship of Olympian Zeus, as the Macedonians called him, or Baal Shamaim, the Lord of Heaven, for the Syrians. Perhaps Menelaus, the high priest, thought that these were merely Gentile names for the one true God. Perhaps he did not care, just so long as he kept his exalted position. As all copies of the scriptures had been confiscated, no one could read Joshua 24:15. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. This new God of heaven was worshipped by the offering of animals that the Orthodox considered to be unclean. Some refused to even say the words Baal Shamaim, considering them to be unclean as well. So instead they said Shikos Shomen, the appalling horror in some versions, or the abomination of desolation in older translations. We have reached the darkest point in Jewish history since the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. But it's always darkest before the dawn. The action shifts to Modin or Modin, the spelling varies depending on who you ask, a small town in western Judah. As in all such towns, a pagan altar had been set up in a public square, and the leading citizens were ordered to worship there. Mattathiah was chosen to set an example and be first up to sacrifice. But Mattathiah was a priest and courageously refused. Someone else stepped forward. There's always someone. Mattathiah was enraged and killed the other citizen and then the Seleucid official, before shouting out his defiance. Everyone who is faithful to God's covenant and obeys his law, follow me. Mattathiah, his 5 sons, along with a number of supporters, headed for the hills to continue the rebellion. Soon, news of a massacre reached them. A group of Hasidim had also run to the hills, but had been tracked by a detachment of the Seleucid army to their refuge in a cave. The Seleucids ordered the Jews to surrender and march out, but this was considered to be a breach of the Sabbath commandment, so they stayed put. The Gentile soldiers had no scruples and massacred the Jews who refused to defend themselves. While one admires their courage, one wonders about whether this was what God intended when he established the 7th day as a day of rest. As someone said later, the Sabbath was made for us, not us for the Sabbath. Mattathiah and his followers agreed to defend themselves on the Sabbath, realizing that if all Jews took the Hasidim's view of Sabbath observance, the rebellion was doomed. While Mattathiah and his 5 sons take centre stage in the account of their deeds in the book of Maccabees, this was not an isolated act of defiance. Had it been, the empire would have struck back and dealt with the rebels there and then. But Mattathiah's defiance had been the spark that set off similar acts around the country. The Hasidim put aside their religious scruples and joined in with a will. Seeing that the Hasidim were on board, many less devout Jews joined the rebel bands. Idols were destroyed. We might remember Gideon doing something similar all those years before. Uncircumcised boys were circumcised, and Antiochus's authority was flouted. His policy of enforced Hellenization was not yet a done deal. However, a guerrilla uprising was always going to struggle in a pitched battle against professional soldiers. Antiochus was no Alexander the Great, but well-equipped and professionally led troops would expect to defeat disorganized and poorly equipped Jewish rebels on any day of the week, not just the Sabbath. In fact, Antiochus was not able to put down the Jewish rebellion himself. His presence was required on his eastern frontier, where news of his humiliation in Egypt had encouraged the Parthians to test Antiochus's defences. It was at about this time, 166 BC or thereabouts, that Mattathiah passed away. His last words are recorded in 1st Maccabees 2, with a final rallying cry to his sons. But you, my sons, be strong and courageous in defending the law, because it is through the law that you will earn great glory. Your brother Simon is wise, so always listen to him as you would to me. Judas Maccabeus has been strong all his life. He will be your commander and will lead you in battle against the enemy. Call everyone who obeys God's law to rally around you. Then avenge the wrongs done to your people. Pay back the Gentiles for what they have done, and always obey the law and its commands. Then Mattathias gave them his blessing and died. Mattathiah was a wise father who understood his son's talents. Judas Hammerhand was indeed a strong man and a shrewd military commander. Like all successful guerrilla chiefs, he played to his strengths. His Jewish warriors knew the terrain and were, so to speak, on home ground. He was able to ambush and rout Syrian military detachments in the hill country, where the Syrian strength in cavalry was negated. In one engagement, Apollonius, the Syrian governor of Judah and Samaria, was killed. In military terms, just another casualty, but in strategic and propaganda terms, a dead governor was a big deal. It showed that the Syrians could be defeated and that Judas was the right man for the mission. Antiochus was still determined to defeat the Parthians to the east and regain his lost territory beyond the river Tigris. Unwisely, he split his command, leaving Lysias in charge of Syrian forces west of the Euphrates, while Antiochus campaigned to the east, which also suggests which campaign Antiochus thought the most important. In 165 BC, Lysias acted. He sent in a much stronger force than the one Apollonius lost. Slave traders followed behind the army, ready to profit from the coming defeat of the Jews. The Syrian army camped at Emmaus, not too far from Jerusalem, as readers of Luke's Gospel may remember. Judas received reliable information from his scouts and so knew that the Jews were outnumbered. This was no longer a guerrilla war with lightly armoured infantry hitting hard and withdrawing fast. The next phase of the conflict would be army against army, with the last one standing the victor. Judas wisely did what the book said to do. With prayer and fasting, a holy war was decreed. Judas took his men to Mizpah, where Samuel had once declared a holy war against the Philistines. There followed some nighttime manoeuvres. A Seleucid commander named Gorgas took a mixed contingent of cavalry and infantry to attack the Jews at first light. But while Gorgas was going one way, Judas and his men were going the other. Judas did to the Syrians what Gorgas had hoped to do to the Jews, came upon them at first light and caused maximum confusion. The Syrians left Emmaus and ran for the fortified towns along the coast. Gorgas, having failed to find the Jewish army, returned to Emmaus to find the Syrian camp in flames and the Jewish troops lined up in battle order ready for a fight. Gorgas could not control his men, who also left to seek refuge in the Greek cities along the coast, leaving Judas in command of the battlefield. God wins. Having failed to defeat the Jews through military muscle, Lysias turned to diplomacy. Antiochus could spare no reinforcements, as things were not going well for him in the east. Negotiations took time, as Lysias felt the need to refer everything to his lord and master, Antiochus, who was not able to return to head the negotiations himself. Meanwhile, Rome had heard that war had broken out in Judah, and as self-appointed guardians of Egypt, sent an embassy to Antioch, calling first at Alexandria. The Jewish leaders managed to get a message to the Roman ambassador, who realized that this was an ideal opportunity to further weaken Syria. Antiochus saw that his anti-Jewish policy was actually weakening his own position, and so he withdrew the ban on Jewish religious practices, although his tame high priest, Menelaus, had to be allowed to remain in control of the temple. One could, perhaps, feel a certain amount of sympathy for Antiochus. He was a man of his times, and it's difficult to imagine any other king of Seleucid Syria acting any differently. Perhaps if he'd followed the example of the king from the south, Ptolemy of Egypt, and treated his Hebrew subjects with a degree of tolerant respect, history may have been different. But Antiochus Epiphanes, God made manifest, set out to control all religious expression throughout his kingdom and treat all gods as equals. But he had not reckoned with the determination of a Jewish priest from the back of beyond standing up to authority and daring to be different. The Jews, once roused to oppose Antiochus, were unstoppable, and under Judas Hammerhand and his brothers, the Syrians were defeated. Once Rome had made it clear that their interests were at stake, Antiochus had little room for manoeuvre. The Roman ambassadors to Antioch were happy to encourage any lessening of his authority, and so gave their support to Jewish demands for religious freedom. However, Antiochus was still determined to keep his own man, Menelaus, as a Hellenizing high priest in Jerusalem. Menelaus and his supporters kept control of the Acra fortress in the heart of Jerusalem. This was later the site of the Roman Antonia fortress of New Testament times that overlooked and oversaw the temple. Oversaw being used in both senses of the word. The garrison could see what was happening in the temple and could therefore control what happened. Judas and his followers could not stand for this. He split his forces and sent sufficient to occupy the full attention of the Acra garrison, while the rest of his men swept into the temple and pulled down the hated altar and all other pagan paraphernalia and dumped the lot of it into a, quote, unclean place. This comes from 1 Maccabees 4. The unclean place may well be the Valley of Hinnom, later known as Gehenna. The original altar in the temple, which had been polluted by the abomination of desolation when unclean animals were sacrificed there, was dismantled. As there was neither a reliable priest nor a recognized prophet to say what should be done with the altar stones, they were dismantled and put into safe storage until a prophet could tell them what to do with them. In the meantime, a new altar made of uncut stones was raised, and all the holy furniture and fittings were restored or replaced, so that on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, 3 years since the first sacrifices were made to Olympian Zeus, the temple was formally rededicated to Yahweh according to the scriptures. A delayed Feast of Tabernacles was held 2 and a bit months later than usual, and everyone rejoiced. Everyone except the Hellenizers, led by the discredited high priest Menelaus. This new service of rededication is not found in the Hebrew Tanakh or the Christian equivalent Old Testament, but it is still celebrated as the eighth-day festival of Hanukkah, or Feast of Lights, because of the Jewish custom of lighting candles at home. Hanukkah usually falls in December, and so in the modern world is sometimes considered to be the Jewish Christmas. Theologically, this is nonsense. But we may remember how Jesus once appeared in Jerusalem at this time of year and announced that he was the light of the world and cleansed the temple. This could not be a coincidence. But back to Judas Hammerhand. No one could doubt the success of the first phase of the Maccabean revolt. Judas had won some notable victories, and the restoration of the temple is celebrated to this day. However, some of the Hasidim thought that with the temple cleansed and worship resumed, there was no need to continue hostilities. Judas and his brothers were not so certain. While Jerusalem was now only nominally under Seleucid control, there were other Jewish communities that were still not free. Judas and his brother Jonathan led a military expedition across the Jordan and liberated several Jewish towns from Greek control. Simon, the oldest son of Mattathiah, did the same in Galilee. However, in May 163 BC, the world changed. Antiochus IV Epiphanes died, possibly from tuberculosis. He'd sent written instructions to Antioch to have his son, another Antiochus, declared king. However, Antiochus had previously suggested that his nephew, Demetrius, a son of Seleucus IV, should have the crown. Demetrius realized that if he did not act quickly, his chance of becoming king would be gone. Antiochus had ordered one of his ministers, Philip, who was with him in the east, to return to Antioch to take up the position of guardian. But back in Antioch, the young Antiochus already had a guardian, the viceroy Lysias, who had no intention of stepping aside. Lysias ignored Philip and had young Antiochus crowned as Antiochus V. Antiochus V Eupator, with Lysias remaining as his guardian. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the Hellenizing high priest Menelaus sent to Antioch for help in resisting the Maccabees. Lysias led a Syrian army south, and Judas and his brother Eleazar and their troops met Lysias at Beth Zechariah, north of Beth Zur. For the first time, the Syrians had included elephants amongst their weapons. Eleazar, seeing a particularly ornate howdah on one of the elephants, went for it, believing that the king must be on board. Eleazar stabbed the elephant on its soft underbelly. The elephant collapsed on Eleazar, crushing him, and all for nothing, as the king was not on board. The first of the 5 sons of Mattathiah was dead. Quick reminder, Mattathiah's 5 sons were Simon, Judas, Jonathan, Eleazar, and John. Eleazar was first to die, and unlike his New Testament namesake, Lazarus, Eleazar was not raised from his grave. In the meantime, diplomatic avenues were being explored. Lysias needed to get back to Antioch as soon as he could, as Philip, the officially appointed regent of young Prince Antiochus, had returned from the east of the kingdom, and Lysias had some questions he needed to answer. So to buy peace with the remaining sons of Mattathiah, now also known by their ancestral name of Hasmoneans, descendants of the priest Hashmon, Lysias offered to compromise. The grant of religious freedom made by Antiochus IV the previous year was repeated and extended so as to recognize the restoration of Orthodox Jewish worship within the temple. However, Lysias insisted that the temple was a place of worship and nothing more, so the fortifications built by the Hasmoneans had to be demolished. Lysias also realized that Menelaus, the Hellenizing high priest, had made his position untenable, so he had to go as well. Lysias's preferred candidate was Alcimus, who was a descendant of Aaron, even if he was not a member of the Oneid branch of the family. The Hasmoneans accepted these terms, and Lysias was able to return to Antioch in time to eject Philip, who took refuge with Ptolemy VI in Egypt. Another refugee heading to Egypt was Onias, son of Onias. His father was Onias III, who'd served as high priest until he was murdered. Onias Jr. should have been next in line for the high priesthood, but Lysias had put his own man, Alcimus, in place. Onias withdrew to Egypt, where he was granted permission to build a temple in Leontopolis in the Delta region, and served there as high priest Onias IV. This Jewish temple in exile remained active for some 230 years, until the Roman general, later emperor Vespasian, closed it in AD 70. Some have speculated as to whether Joseph and Mary took baby Jesus to visit this temple while they were in exile themselves, awaiting the death of King Herod. But we all know that speculation is not proof. I hope that, if nothing else, you can see that this period in Israel's history was chaotic. The chosen people were usually outnumbered and sometimes under attack from within and without. God raised one family to save his people, and although the parallel is never made within the text, the sons of Mattathiah have much in common with the judges of olden days. Curiously, some of the names of the Maccabees reoccur during the Zealot uprising against Rome in the 1st century AD. This led the scholar William Farmer to speculate as to whether some of the Zealot leaders actually changed their names to those of the sons of Mattathiah in a bid to make the link in the popular imagination to instill the belief that if the Maccabees could defeat the Seleucids, then the Zealots could defeat Rome. It's an interesting idea, but does not convince me, as all the names were always popular throughout Jewish history. But as I've said before, I do not believe in coincidences. I leave that with you. Syrian generals came and went, but their policy remained the same: to break Jewish resistance, but always with the awareness that Syrian troops needed to be in two places at once, as the wars on their eastern front continued. So the Syrians could not afford the manpower to win at any cost, yet needed to wrap up the Jewish war before Rome intervened. While Judas Hammerhand seems to have had a great faith in God, he was also ready to look for help, and so initiated negotiations with Rome around about the year 161 BC. Roman policy in the east at this time was to weaken remaining Macedonian kingdoms, ideally without having to commit their own troops. An independent Judah would be a useful wedge between Macedonian Egypt and Macedonian Syria, and would give the Romans a convenient bridgehead if ever they saw the need to send in the legions. And ultimately, Rome needed Egypt to feed the ever-growing population of the city. In later years, Egypt would be known as the breadbasket of Rome. The last great victory of Judas Maccabee was against the Syrian general Nicanor. Nicanor had threatened to demolish the Jerusalem temple and replace it with a Greek one. Hearing that Judas was operating in the region of Samaria, Nicanor went after him. At the pass of Beth Horon, the site of an earlier victory of the Jews under Judas against the Syrians, history repeated itself, and Nicanor was killed and his army defeated. Nicanor's head and hands were cut off and sent to Jerusalem, where they were displayed outside the temple he had vowed to destroy. The battle was on the 13th of Adar, the 9th of March in our calendar, in the year 161 BC. This happened to be the day before the festival of Purim, and became a sort of Purim Eve, known as Nicanor's Day. Fame of a sort, I suppose. However, this was Judas' final victory. The Syrians wrapped up their campaign in the east and were able to send in more reinforcements to put an end to the Maccabean rebellion. In the spring of 160, Judas and his men, heavily outnumbered, were defeated at another battle at the pass of Beth Horon. Judas was killed in action and mourned throughout Israel, as recorded in 1 Maccabees 9, verses 20 and 21. All Israel mourned for him in great sorrow for many days. They said, "It can't be. The mighty hero and saviour of Israel has been killed." The other deeds of Judas, his battles, his courageous deeds, and his great accomplishments were too many to write down. So with Eleazar dead in 163 and Judas in 160, counting backwards in BC, remember, that leaves 3 of the 5 sons of Mattathiah, Simon, Jonathan, and John. From about now, both Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria become increasingly chaotic as they continue to fight, while increasingly starting to worry about the threat from the West in the Roman Republic and its expansionist agenda. The remaining sons of Mattathiah continued to fight against the odds to maintain Jewish independence. However, with the temple cleansed and rededicated, and Alchimus, a high priest from the family of Aaron, in charge, the deeply religious Hasidim saw no need to continue the fight, although, as time passed, some grew increasingly disillusioned with the outlook of the Hasmoneans and withdrew to live in the Judean wilderness near the Dead Sea, where they wrote some remarkable scrolls that were hidden during the war with Rome in the 1st century AD, not discovered until the 20th. We do not have time to examine the Dead Sea Scrolls in this series, but it is at this point in history that they started to be written. Back to the next son of Mattathiah to take command. After the death of son number 3, Judas Hammerhand, son number 5 took over. This is Jonathan. His leadership falls into 2 parts. At first, from about 161 to 153 BC, he was fighting a defensive war against the Seleucid general Bacchides. However, Bacchides was unable to win a decisive victory, and from 153 to 143 BC, the power struggle for the throne in Antioch between Demetrius I and Alexander Ballas gave Jonathan room for manoeuvre, with both would-be kings seeking his support. Eventually, Jonathan backed Alexander Ballas, who allowed Jonathan to take the now vacant high priesthood in Jerusalem. The instability in Syria continued, with Demetrius II, son of Demetrius I, trying to take the throne from Alexander Ballas. Once he succeeded, Alexander's son, Antiochus VI, and his guardian, General Tryphon, tried for the crown. With all this infighting going on to the north, Jonathan was able to extend Jewish rule into the Philistine plain, taking control of Ashdod, Joppa, Gaza, and Ekron, and also taking parts of Samaria and Galilee. we see the map of intertestamental Judah starting to resemble Herod's kingdom at the opening of the New Testament. However, Jonathan's good run did not last, and he was tricked and taken prisoner by Tryphon at Beth Shean and executed in 143 BC. Now it was the turn of Mattathias' second son, Simon, to become commander-in-chief and high priest. Simon also benefited from Syrian instability, supporting Demetrius II against Tryphon, who, having assassinated his ward, Antiochus VI, had taken the throne for himself. Demetrius rewarded Simon with independence for Judah. So in the 170th year of the Seleucid kingdom, 142 BC in our terms, Simon became high priest and commander, and to all intents and purposes, king of the Jews. And that's about as good as it got for the Maccabees, now known as the Hasmoneans. The temple had been restored, and the Jews in a now expanded Judah were self-governing. But all too soon their leaders drifted from the ideals of Mattathias of Modin and his 5 courageous sons. The next generation took their lead from the remaining Macedonian royal families and became worldly in the eyes of the faithful Hasidim. I can list their names for the record, and if you want to find out more, you can track them down in Josephus. After Simon came his son, John Hyrcanus. Then it was Hyrcanus's eldest son, Aristobulus I, who reigned for just part of 1 year. Then a younger son of Hyrcanus succeeded his brother Aristobulus. This was Alexander Jannaeus. He reigned for 27 years and extended the borders of Judah northwards along the coastal plain to Mount Carmel and across the Jordan to the east. And this was the high point of the political and military successes of the Hasmoneans. Alexander Jannaeus was not one to take prisoners. He liked his enemies dead, and by the time of his own death in 76 BC, the people would not accept his son Hyrcanus, so instead Alexander's widow, Alexandra Salome, took control. She was known to have opposed her husband's excesses, but of course, as a woman, even a queen, she could not be high priest. So she delegated her son Hyrcanus to the priesthood. High priest Hyrcanus favoured the Pharisees, which led to resentment from the majority of the population who were not Pharisees. So when Queen Alexandra died, Hyrcanus remained as high priest, and his younger brother Aristobulus took the throne as Aristobulus II. This was in 67 BC. However, Hyrcanus changed his mind, and with support from the king of Nabatea, Aretas III, besieged Jerusalem. Meanwhile, to the north, the Roman general Pompey, self-proclaimed as Pompey the Great, had been ordered by the Roman Senate to mop up the remaining Macedonian kingdoms at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Pompey had sent a delegation ahead of him to Damascus. Both brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, asked for Roman support. The legate backed Hyrcanus and ordered King Aretas to withdraw to Nabatea. When Pompey arrived in Syria in person at the end of the year 64 or early 63 BC, both brothers tried again, and this time a third Jewish delegation joined the debate. This third group, possibly Pharisees, asked for the Hasmonean monarchy to be abolished. Aristobulus rushed back to Jerusalem and took control, closely followed by an angry Pompey with his Roman legionaries. After a brief siege, Pompey and his men entered the city, and the Hasmonean kingdom became the Roman province of Judea. This is the year 63 BC. While no longer ruling Judah, the Hasmoneans remained a power in the land, so that in 29 BC, an up-and-coming Edomite thought it politically expedient to marry a Hasmonean princess. Her name was Mariamne, and her husband was Herod, later King Herod, the Herod we meet in the opening chapters of Matthew's Gospel. More on him another time. As I said earlier, to me, the actions of faithful Mattathiah and his brave sons reminded me of the judges. The later Hasmoneans remind me of the last kings of Judah before the Lord sent Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army to teach them a lesson. And throughout the Hasmonean period, there is no word from God. If there were any prophets active in this period, there is no mention of them in any of the surviving sources. Perhaps the time was not yet ready, but it would be soon. So thank you once again for your polite attention. We'll stop with a prayer, and we'll make a reminder of any notices, and then we can open up for any chat if anybody wants to hang on for a bit longer. But let's pray.